welcome to the ICA and to Lola's book launch. I'm really happy that so many people have come and that we get to celebrate Lola's book tonight. And so I'm Nisha. I'm the learning curator at the ICA. It was my pleasure to organize this with Lola and Abeera and Hajar Press. If you're just coming in, feel free to find whatever seats are available. So the format for the evening will be that Hajar Press will do some introductions, Lola will do some readings, and then Lola and Abeera will be in conversation, followed by a Q&A. For the Q&A, there will be roving mics, so you can find me or one of the ICA staff members. We will come and drop a mic off to you if you have any questions for our speakers. Other than that, you can find Hajar Press's books at the bookstore, and after this, you're all welcome to the ICA bar, which is open until 10. Okay. So thank you very much.
Okay, hello. This feels very surreal. Thank you all so much for joining us today. And of course, thank you to the truly wonderful Lola and Abeera for doing this event with us. Yeah, go for it. My name is Brechna, and Farhana and I are the founders of Hajar Press, a new, independent, and proudly political publishing house run by and for people of color. When we say that Hajar is a political press, what that means for us is that we're absolutely not neutral, and that we take a clear position on things like racial capitalism, on Palestine, on abolition. And when we were both setting up Hajar, it wasn't very difficult to articulate what we wanted the press to be because there was so clearly a need for it. In the context of certain histories and experiences being actively erased or willfully neglected, in an industry where writers and publishing staff are only given a platform to serve diversity optics and thrown under the bus when they become inconvenient or the news cycle moves on to the next big disaster, we felt really sick of the cynicism of the mainstream publishing industry, and we wanted to try our hardest to build something completely new. In terms of writing, we want to publish books by writers of color that combine political engagement with literary innovation. There's a line that we always use when describing Hajar's work, that there's no either or between the revolutionary and the beautiful. We think that really captures our list and the gorgeous body of literature that we're trying to publish. These are the ideas and motivations that drove us to set up Hajar. But really, for both of us, for Farhana and I, our work in running the press is mostly sitting behind our computers every evening, trying to balance this alongside paid work in an absolute state of panic, wondering what the hell we've gotten ourselves into, how on earth we're going to get this done on time, and whether we're actually going to financially survive in the next couple of months, sprinkled, of course, with the casual racism of our industry and everything else wrong with it. And that's why moments like this are so surreal, because you see what the impact of this work actually is. And I mean, it's totally mind-boggling to us that we've published this groundbreaking book by Lola, that we're hosting this event tonight here at the ICA with these two incredible people, that all of you came to listen to this, and that our first print run of experiments sold out in less than a month. And that's without any actual distribution, so it's kind of bonkers. Anyway, so thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Thank you to our friends and family for supporting us at times when we felt we'd fall apart, Thank you to everyone who supported us in last year's crowdfunder. Thank you to everyone here for building such excitement around the project and around the book. Thank you to our writers. Thank you to Lola for trusting us with your work. Please subscribe to our list to continue supporting us. And please keep spreading the word. I am now going to hand over to Farhana, my partner in crime, to say more about the book itself.
Okay, I'm just going to say a little bit about the book and about our speakers. I'm just going to read. Experiments in Imagining Otherwise is a set of vivid written fragments harnessing the radical potential of the feminist imagination. Lola plays with the possibilities offered by the otherwise, showing us how we can disrupt the ideological prescriptions of linear temporal regimes and read the past, the present, and the future differently. The book is creative in every sense, from how the words sit on the page to the many new worlds it asks us to call into existence. It's grounded in an understanding of Black feminist political legacies and how these histories commune with how we live and remake our social relations today. To paraphrase one of the endorsers, Zoe Samudzi, this is a book for dreamers. But at the same time, it isn't fanciful or utopian. Utopian being something Lola says everyone knows is a code word for not possible. As Lola says, she's trying to inflate the material. These dreams are as real as anything else we can say both about what it's like to live in this world and about the political horizon. Experiments was written during a devastating pandemic in which more than 5 million people have died globally. Lola begins by setting down her despair about the way things are, but this is not a book about despair. It is a book about failure, mistakes, losing, and being caught in a perpetual loop. But more importantly, it's about belief, collective refusal, rejection of a world that is killing us, trying again and again and again, and about how something important is changed in the doing. I'll now introduce our two speakers. Lola Olufemi is a Black feminist writer and Cream Stuart Hall Foundation researcher from London. Her work focuses on the uses of the feminist imagination and its relationship to cultural production, political demands, and futurity. She's the author of Experiments in Imagining Otherwise and Feminism Interrupted, Disrupting Power, as well as a member of Bare Minimum, an interdisciplinary anti-work arts collective. Abeera Khan is a fellow in gender and culture at the Department of Sociology at LSE and a PhD candidate at the Centre for Gender Studies at SOAS. Her thesis is a genealogical analysis of the queer Muslim within imperial legacies of British sexual exceptionalisms and racialized moral panics. She is published in the Feminist Review, Lambda Nordica, Religion and Gender, and Pole Journal. She teaches on the subjects of diaspora, empire, race, feminist studies, and queer of colour critique. I'll now pass over to Lola for a reading.
Thank you all so much for coming. I actually cannot believe how many people are here. I'm going to read from the beginning of the book, but yeah, in a way I think outlines what I'm trying to do. I hold, like those before me, that experiments can and do fail. I'm trying to make an argument for the otherwise. Not otherwise as in over there, come find me, or a small black dot that recedes as I approach. Not that thing that is obscured and needs to be unobscured. Not a smudge or an absence or an entity to be owned or conquered. The future is no one's property. No need to shackle it. Not otherwise as in the political horizon awaits. Otherwise as in a firm embrace of the unknowable. The unknowable is in a well of infinity I want us to fall down together. Otherwise, the future is now, and all those political promises we make to one another, all the wishing and hoping and earnest, say it 3 times like a spell, wishing and hoping, wishing and hoping, wishing and hoping, all the leaps from the edges of bridges and mountaintops, all the reaching for and around, all the drug taking and sex everywhere we should not, all the serious study and strategy, theorizing and making anew, all the breakages that slice historical space-time, all those movements that clear space and mark our struggle to live free, to live better, love more, to knit abundance. All that is the work of another realm that is not here. I am trying to make an argument for unbounded, effective technologies that go beyond the body, beyond the rights-bearing citizen, that precede revolutionary violence, subtend misery, technologies that eject us anywhere but the drawn-out present. Now, the counter-arguments. against the idea that this is not real politics or that the material is stripped by every wish for the unknowable, I say yes. I am trying to inflate the material. I am reaching for the creation of a general mood, for a stirring that awakens. I am trying to shake you so you wake up and wake up ready. You are going to have to give something up, and it will not be easy. Some of us are not ready for narrative disruption. We will have to be pulled, kicking and screaming from this world and its falsities. Here is my method. Above all, feeling. I aim, through experiments in feeling, to reveal and destroy what it is that keeps us here, what it is that stops us from deciding to leave, even as the cinders mix with our hair, the smoke corrupts our lungs, the flames engulf the people we love. Only when we know this can we activate the bond of the otherwise and turn back to meet it. Some call it the communist horizon. This implies some distance between us and the future. Others call it prefiguration, the future in our actions. Others, the worlds we seek to build. Desire, desire, desire. Any name will do. I'll stop there.
I want you to tell me more about this piece and why you wanted to begin with it.
So I wanted to start at the beginning, I think, because I think the beginning of the book outlines, I guess, the argument that I'm trying to make, which is that I see that there is some connection between the imagination or imaginative potential and our impetus to act and resist. And by that, I mean that the imagination is connected to our emotional being in the world. Like, it has some effect on our ability to be with each other, our ability to be in relation with each other, but also that if we downplay the importance of imaginative thinking in the strategy of what we're going to do with a set of very urgent conditions, I see that as a kind of mistake. And often we find ourselves, people who are wanting to live better, to put it lightly, find ourselves always in an impasse, always stuck, always trying to think, how do we escape the drawn-out present? And for me, taking the imagination seriously and the link specifically that it has to materiality and our ability to make critical interventions into space, into discourses, into like whatever, that to me is like the kind of revolutionary potential, I would say, of the imagination. And I guess I'm also trying to make this argument that the things that we feel are structures of feeling in I guess, like the Raymond Williams sense. Like, that's also incredibly important in our ability to conceive of what comes next, or not even what comes next, what is happening currently. So that's I guess what I want to start with.
I think it reminds me of when you say, or when you reference Raymond Williams, it reminds me of Lauren Berlant in the introduction. In the introduction to Cruel Optimism, Lauren Berlant, referencing Raymond Williams, says that affect is a form of shared historical time, and I think that's something that is really embodied in how you think about feeling and how you interact with feeling in this book. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, I think when I think about Berlant, I think about that quote also at the beginning of Cruel Optimism, where they say this thing about like even those people that you would think of as defeated are like human beings who are trying to find a way to stay attached to life from within it. I read that and I've been thinking about it because, so many of us in the cultural space, whatever, in the political space, are defeated, right? And the question always comes up of like, what are we going to do? Like, what are we going to do next? How are we going to escape this moment that we're in? And for me, what I'm trying to do with this book is to really hone in on what they say about attachments to life and attachments not only to living, but the things that tether us to this world, right? And the things that, and I guess trying to find a way for us to make the distinctions between the things that keep us here and the sacrifices that we'll have to make in order to let go of the way that we live now. And yeah, my friends know, I think, that like relation is incredibly important to me, and I think central to this book because I'm trying to take emotion seriously and to say actually that's not a frivolous thing. Our impetus to resist comes precisely from our ability to conceive, which is connected to our emotional relationships to the world, to each other, and so.
I think that what you're saying reminds me of, or makes me think of how, to me, a central question of this book is also, what could life be like? And I think that, in a way, your last book and this book are both reckoning with that question, but in different ways. And I'm really curious as to how you see Feminism Interrupted as different from this book, and especially in terms of audience. Because I think Feminism Interrupted, to me, is more hinged on, is possibly more instructive, and maybe realize its political registers may be persuasion, you know, and it's a bit more hinged on kind of, to me, almost a pedagogic book, which is not to say that this isn't, but in a way, it's kind of this, like, come join us, you know? Whereas with this one, the way that I read it was, it felt like you were addressing people that you felt you were already in community with, but were maybe kind of inviting for collective deliberation rather than something else.
Yeah, I think that with Feminism Interrupted, I guess what I was trying to do is was to make like a critical intervention into discourses on feminism. And I thought long and hard about whether I was the right person to do that, whether I could do it well. And I think in people reading that book, what I really like is that I know for people who have maybe never thought like critically or in that way about the potential that feminism offers us, what I really love about those interactions is that I'm like, you're going to outgrow this book, or at least how it's written, or at least like, you know, how it skims over certain arguments, whatever. You're going to have more questions, and that's exciting. And I think it's not so much that I was not trying to do that with this book, but I think it's that I was trying to take a more kind of fragmentary approach. And I was actually on the question of like collaboration. I wanted this book to feel like an invitation, but to also I wanted the readers to feel like we were going through it together. That like I'm speaking to you directly, and I'm asking you to do these tasks. I'm leaving space so that you can also write. That the book, which is a commodity, which is the thing that is, you know, you're going to buy, I would give it away for free, you know? Like I would, and I say that in the book that I plan to give many more things away for free in that register, because I think that's the point at which like true collaboration is possible. And I think I was watching this talk with Fred Moten and Stefano Harvey recently, and they were talking about like the potential of collaboration, and they were saying multiple things, but what the things that I took away was that collaboration heightens responsiveness. That's what they were saying. Not like responsibility as an individual moral act, but our responsiveness to each other. And I guess that's what I'm trying to do here, is like heighten a sense of like, okay, actually, we are a group of people who are thinking and feeling in the same way. What does that mean? How can we do that together? How can we feel across all of these structures and across the way, across how the world is organized to like siphon us off and isolate? How might we like break that in lots of ways?
I think it makes me think of like all the little parts in the book where you invite people to write in, and you ask people to join in on it. I think it'd be a really good idea if you ask people to send those in to you, like make something out of that.
At the end.
Okay, so I really love that sentence, I'm trying to inflate the material. So I want you to read one of the pieces that I think really does that. One of my favorite pieces.
Oh.
Strike?
Okay.
Yeah.
I was like,
what were you thinking?
I was like, is this a wildcat? Yes, I will read that. So this piece is called Strike. What's the mood of the general strike? I think something changes in the air. Particles rearrange themselves to spell enough kidnapping in the dead of night. Murder, endless poverty stretching for miles and miles. If you observed the mood, you might be able to hear your heartbeat in your tooth and then your toenail, then the very tips of your fingers. The mood of the general strike is not in the body of man. It's burrowed deep in the earth. It begins to shake every time the past defeats itself and the clock simmers. The mood of the general strike might only be defined by what it is not. If I had to approximate, I can only say something like, imagine you are a free diver and you break the surface when you were expecting to drown. Imagine that breath, the sheer scope of it, the relief that floods through you. In Haiti and Sudan, it's hot sun and barricading the streets. For Amazon workers in America, it's union meetings in nondescript buildings. For the enslaved, it was choosing your own death, sabotaging commodity. The general strike happens when North meets South. It's when newness runs its finger over the impasse that is the contemporary. The general strike is a point of departure. It's a strikeout, a refusal to play the game. It's a strike. The act of marking one's target. It's a strike. An act of violent insurrection. It's a strike. A correction of the old mistake. It's a strike. Hard to read and even harder to describe. The mood of the general strike is solemn. It's the moment you realize that you have to do something with the life you have taken back. The general mood of the general strike is the parceling out of the boss's bones to pick our teeth with. The mood of the general strike is either you are with us or you will be crushed, no nuance. The mood of the general strike is scorched earth and nobody narrating it as it happens. The mood of the general strike is when the text becomes discernible, just for a moment. The general strike is staring at what was once obscured until you can make out its edges like you are doing now. It's recognition despite restriction, a recognition of yourself for what you are, a worker. The general strike says, instead of working for the man, let's work for love. Let's work for each other. Let's work so nobody ever has to work again. Let's work for song and for dance. Let's work in service of pleasure. Let's work and work and work so we can finally talk about something other than work. What's the color of the general strike? Well, to know that, you have to know the color of the future. That's easy. A mix of every color currently imaginable. But mostly, that color that is the absence of light. You know the one.
I think that in the beginning when you say now to the counter-argument, this to me is one of the pieces that feels like the counter-argument. And one thing I really love about the book is how you are trying to put forth this idea that the immaterial, the aesthetic, joy, pleasure are not counter-revolutionary, they're not frivolous, that they're not unserious. So I want to know, what are you trying to tell the vulgar materialists?
I think that, yeah, you're right. I think one thing that is important to me and has been important to my politics is this idea that when faced with this question of everything is so overwhelming, what do we do? That something is changed in the doing. So in the moment of the strike, in the moment of the sit-in, I'm sure people who have done organizing or been in political spaces know what I mean. In the moment of political consciousness, something shifts, whether it's inside you, whether it's in the room, whether it's, in your relation to something, to somebody else. And that in itself is a kind of work, right? So yes, I guess I am trying to say that's an important part of these worlds that we're envisaging, right? We can't envision them without also joy, also, pleasure. What will sex look like? What will all of these fun things look like? Because that's an important question. It can't only be misery, because a lot of the strategizing is. But I also say that to say, I hope other parts of the book counter it, to say that I hope when people read, they know that I don't think that's the whole work, right? The work is not only feeling alone, it's also about what we do materially, how we keep each other alive in a very serious way, what, forms of direct action we take, what refusal we enact, our refusal to comply in loads of different arenas and spaces. Those things, I'm trying to say that there needn't be a kind of antagonistic relationship between those two things, right? They exist and can inform each other. And I feel like often, I hate to talk about the left because it's who are you talking about? There are so many. But on specific sections, there's always a dismissal of this thing called pleasure or this thing called euphoria or feeling or whatever. And that's why it's also easy for these sections to dismiss gender, or dismiss, aspects of identity, however you critique them, because, that's frivolous, that's unserious, that's not somehow rooted in the material, which we all know is nonsense. Exactly. But I guess through the feeling, I'm in attempting to evoke that feeling in a textual way, at least, that commitment or argument is clear.
In a way, I think I like to essentialize that part of the left. I'm like, oh, the lads on the left. Like, who gives a shit? But I think what you said about gender reminds me of that, like, that essay by Kay Gabriel that we both love, where she's kind of addressing she's addressing two different arguments, but I'm interested in like how she's addressing like the dismissal of like trans embodiment, right, and the desire for transition. And she says this thing of like the abolition of gender means the end of gendered abjection, but not the end of gendered signification. And she has this quote that, so while I was reading the book and while I was preparing for this talk, I was thinking about the different texts that I am putting this book in conversation with. And she has this quote that really made me think of what you're saying and what this book is saying, which is, the critical question is then not whether transsexual desires are appropriately counter-ideological, but what is to be done given that we have the desires that we do. And I think that what is to be done given that we have given that we have the desires that we do, that to me, there is something there in this book about desire and that being taken seriously in a material and immaterial sense as a site of struggle, but also as a site of informing our struggle. Anything to say on that?
You summed it up so beautifully. I don't even know what I could add. Yeah, I think you're right. I think that also desire does. I think in the spaces that like we are in, or like when we talk to our friends, actually anyone, the things that you desire are immediately apparent. And I'm saying, I said in like previous book launch that I want this book to also in a way be an offering to other people, but also some record that my desire was not this that we currently have. I want anything else, because like I see the way that this world extracts, exploits, and manufactures misery for so many people around me, and manufactures also a kind of pain. And so I feel like desire is a way, or at least stating openly, and I guess in a very sincere and earnest way, what my desire is to say I want other people to meet me with their own desires, and in that space then we start something, we make something, we yearn for something together, and that informs the material work that we do. But also as this way of saying, I don't ever want there to be any mistake that I shied away from arguments, or that like in any creative work that I did, I was scared to say capitalism must end at the very least, or everything must go, right? I really think that that's incredibly important, especially because we were kind of saying this earlier. I think that like there's this wave of ambivalence that is coming over like specific forms of cultural production. So, you know, you're supposed to be distant and ironic, and you know, desire is not cool, and neither is sincerity. But I think I'm trying to make it cool.
Sure. I mean, we've all read the book. No one believes that.
I think there's a link there also to like political responsibility. If I say to you, here is what my desire is, then you're able to meet me and say, okay, your job is to do X, Y, Z, or you say that this is what you want, and here's how we do it together. That I think strengthens bonds rather than running away from it. You know.
On that note, I want you to read the next piece that I think, to me, reminds me of one of the central themes of this book, which is we need to do it together, which is what you already said, relation. That's on technology, if you're wondering.
Against on-tech knowledge. Some call that an escape from the misery of the day. Utopia becomes retreat, or another map for the future. But I want the full story suspended in impossibility, dripping with conjured things, information in medias res. And in place of data, there would only be stuff to make more of that good stuff. No maps, no coordinates or routes. Only a pattern of intensities that responds to the skin on our fingertips. A pattern that changes every 10 minutes. I want facts to curdle. That's a spoilt substance we could use. I want knowledge you can sit a while in. Knowledge that won't expel you for pontificating. Knowledge that knows there is no certitude in a political economy that wants you dead, or worked to death, or alive but not really there, or banished, or picking up off scraps, or preoccupied with the violence done onto you, so hurt you find it hard to breathe whilst drowning in a bed of your tears, so alienated you look at yourself and you say, who is that? Or sectioned, or having a heart attack age 46, or flesh blown to smithereens, or living in the shadow of an assassinated martyr, or earning your breakfast, lunch and dinner, or going hungry so your kids eat, or rotting in a flat somewhere, or trapped by something as arbitrary as a border. Sorry if the fantastic seems appealing. We're alive there.
So at your last book launch, when you were speaking to Amani, one thing I was quite surprised by is how you said that people often come up to you and say that, oh, I find this book very hopeful. And I don't know why that really annoyed me, because and I really checked myself for that, because I'm not someone who disavows hope, and neither are you. But you also said that you were confused by that. And I think it's really interesting that people read it as simply hopeful, because I think it oscillates between like useful political cynicism, but also a kind of I know you disavowed the utopic earlier, but I think it does do that like work of like what Munoz calls like concrete utopias, right? The realm of educated hope that is propelling itself towards a material imagination. A material imagination. And it made me think of kind of the struggle that is relation. And I think how you in this book really struggle with that work of collective struggle and how it involves fighting with each other, and that can often not be pretty. And again, it made me think of another piece that I really love that I want to read a quote from. It's a Gail Lewis essay that's kind of a really short piece. It's kind of meta. It's Gail Lewis responding to Robin Wiegman, who is writing an essay on Eve Sedgwick, who has written an essay on Melanie Klein. It's a very meta piece. It's a bunch of queer feminists talking to each other, basically. But at the heart of all of these essays, and at the heart of what Gail Lewis is doing, is she's asking, what does knowledge do? You know, and in this piece, she's arguing for connection. And she's arguing that the project of knowledge is connection. So I want to read the opening passage to this essay, because she starts with a problem, and I think you're both reckoning with the same problem. And I want you to respond to that. So she writes, "Let me start by saying I have a problem. It is a problem that is emotional, intellectual, relational, and materializes in the varieties of practice that shape and are shaped by the terrains, legacies, and cultures I inhabit. It is a problem of how to contribute to the work of laying bare for examination and eradication the patterns and processes which give life to and sustain the toxicity of racism, misogyny, homophobia, class hatred, and disableism, while simultaneously remaining open to those who are not me and their vulnerabilities."
No small task. Yeah, I think that there are so many things in what you said. I guess I'll start with the hope, and then I'll come back. I agree with you that we both kind of take the same stance in not disavowing hope. And I think maybe what irks me when hope is evoked is that I read that as people meaning optimism. And I remember one time, like after doing this talk with, or interviewing Saidiya Hartman for her book, we went to this Korean restaurant, which is also in the book, and she said, optimism is too facile a thing. You know, we need something stronger, something more grounded. And she said hope. And yeah, that to me, I think sums up my understanding of, I guess, when hope is evoked, what people mean. And I guess I mean it in the same way that Munoz means it. And I just wanted to, say that. But then in relation to the quote that you've just read out about Gail, I think that the work of Black feminism, in my understanding, or in the way that I've related to it, has been clarification, has been one of building a way of seeing, but also, as Gail Lewis says in another place, one of ethical relation, right? Like one of trying to conceive across temporal boundaries and regimes how we might be able to connect and see one another. And one way that I'm thinking about that, I guess, in my own work and in this book is by trying to loosen our attachments to this thing called the past, present, and future. And to get us to understand that, like, the way that movements, for example, are historicized makes us always feel as if we are not doing enough in the current moment because back then they did X, Y, Z, and look where they shut down and look what they, But we are also in a moment, right? We're in a drawn-out present, and we will be historicized in the same way. But I guess this book is asking, what if we looked outside of the boundaries of, like, a linear understanding of the movement of time from A to B, and instead understood time as a circle or any other kind of diagram. And I remember one time I was talking to someone about the circle, and she said, oh, you're talking about chaos, you're talking about the necessity of, like, of urgency and all of this stuff, but a circle is not a very chaotic image. And I was thinking about this today, and I was like, it absolutely is. When you introduce the idea that time repeats itself to somebody who understands that time means always forward movement or progression, the idea that right now we could be moving sideways instead of forward, that really fucks people up. They're not like able to do it, but I think it is a useful way to help us, like, get past the stuckness of the current moment. And it reminds me of this thing. It's like I'm doing my PhD on the same thing, and there's this guy called Stengers, and he says this thing that there are futures that the present could never anticipate, and they already inhere in it as possibilities to be actualized. And I feel like that's where I'm at with, like, this book. Like, it is exploring what inheres in this moment that calls us back, but that's calling us forward, that's bringing us in, taking us in loads of different directions, but also allows us to, I think, answer a range of problems without falling into despair or desperation. And instead, I guess, to go back to the beginning of what you were saying, instead of hope, I'd like to think of it as like a principled determination, and to I guess indicate to people that, like, I know what needs to be done and what needs to be sacrificed, and I'm trying to build a structure of feeling that allows me to do that, to give everything up if necessary. And will you, like, join me in that as well? Like,
I think it's, like, also asking us to feel with structural violence, not ignoring the fact that it leaves an impact on us, it leaves an impact on the collective. And I think what you're describing is something I think about a lot in terms of pedagogy, like and it's why I'm so in love with that that like 7-page Gail Lewis essay, because it makes me think of, what is the utility of education, especially like social theory, that just tells us things are bad and getting worse, and what is our responsibility if that's what we're imparting onto the people around us.
I think also, like, not to say that the response necessarily to that is that things are good. Things are not good. They are very bad. But the more urgent question is, what do we do with that? And how do we understand our doing as actually, even if it doesn't feel like it, changing and shifting, a landscape?
I think it's what you're saying about, okay, so things are not good now. Things were not better before. I think that, and that's something that you also, you said that in your response just now, but I think that's something that's said in the book a lot as well. And I think it really shows in your engagement with the archive. And I want to hear more about that, because I think that you're not doing that thing of excavation. And you say that in the book. You're not doing that thing of that impulse to look for an instructive past that will tell us how to deal with the present, because they were also figuring it out. We're all figuring it out.
And I think part of it is having the humility to understand that we are not the only people that have experienced a drawn-out present, right? And so I feel like in my engagements with the archive, I guess I'm thinking about it in terms of Sadiya Hartman, like the archive is not a state of tomb, it's not a tomb of state documents. It's not a place where you go to figure out the future, in my opinion. It's a place where you go to meet history and to decide what to do with it. And also, I think what's really key to me, and there's a piece in here where I do some speculative writing from a picture of Olive Morris, who was like a black communist squatter, and kind of central to black feminist formations in the UK. And your question about the archive makes me think also about what the realm of the speculative does, how it introduces this like tenseless time, this time that cannot be thought about in the ways that we think about it. And so, yeah, for me, the archive, I feel like such a nerd when I go there, because like in experiencing this material, I feel like I'm so woo about it, but
it's not a bad thing to be.
Yeah, it is exciting, and it is like, oh, this pain was felt before. These questions were had. These questions was like kind of said before. People were having the same conversations, which has its own air of being depressing, but is also a way to say, okay, I'm not alone, right? And I'm also in conversation with these people when I'm figuring out what we do in this moment, but also how we bring the future into this moment as well. That's been done before, and so instead of this project of like filling in the grand narrative of history by just like opening up the gaps and inserting all the people that were forgotten or erased, whatever, I think it's a more useful project and more interesting and exciting to attempt to convene with those people through speculation, through, a number of different methods.
I think also from our own private conversations, we've also talked about how the archive tells us that people were messy back then.
Yeah.
People were very messy.
They didn't like each other. And people don't like each other now.
And the archive, especially certain archives, especially, ephemera.
The gays.
The queers of color as well. There's a lot of gossip in the archive. Yeah. Tell me more about how you feel about people being... I think, like, that short story that you wrote, where that academic goes back and forth, that, to me, is a form of narrativizing gossip in a way.
Yeah. There's a story in this book, and it includes this, like, academic who's, like, bumbling and, like, very annoying, and I don't want to say too much, but I had a person in mind when I was writing it. That's all I'll say.
I know who it was. If you buy me a drink after, I will tell you.
But yeah, I did have a person in mind, but I say that to address your question, which is that I think gossip also, in a way, is a means of unofficial history, but also, invites us into all of these, like, different routes. And it can feel maybe that there's a dearth of gossip at the moment, but it's like everyone is always being talked about in some respect. And what I'm interested in about, this is just a tangent, in this current moment, is how that gossip also will be historicized. Who will say, oh, this person was talking about this and that, blah, 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 and these...
Twitter is the archive. It will tell us all.
Maybe.
If it survives the revolution. Okay, one thing I wanted to ask you about, speaking of queerness, I think your work is often read through the lens or through the register of feminism, which obviously, yes, feminism, it says what it's doing. But I also want to hear about how queerness collides with your work, how you see queerness colliding with feminism, working against it, working with it, and how it operates in this book. Actually, first, I want you to, before you answer that question, or as a way of answering that question, I want you to pick a passage that you think is queer.
This is a short one, actually.
Oh, I know which one it is.
This is just from, like, some small little, like, vignettes in the book. You can theorize anything. I'm always asking girls to roll me cigarettes outside the gay club. Best way. I hate you. Best way into any conversation. Best way to capture a night before it leaves you. Something about how the effective dimensions of queer intimate space. Sometimes the girls want to put theory down and dance. But getting further and further away from theoretical proposition does not automatically mean we get closer and closer to each other. Therein lies the problem. Anyway, back to the free cigarettes and shared moments. I don't care what anyone says. That's a kind of political work. Thank you. yeah, I guess to answer your question, I don't know, we've had lots of like conversations about this, and I think when I was younger, I did have a tendency to exceptionalize queer subjectivity, and I still do. I'm working through it. But I think in knowing you and in being in relation with you, I've realized, and I'm continuing to realize, that like queerness is best spoken about in terms of my own work through the language of methodology. And I think that in lots of ways, Feminism Interrupted was also a queer text because it was collaborative. And I think one thing about queerness that is really, to me, central is that it's not it doesn't seem like an individual project. In the making of your own life, in the crafting of, you know, a space, a way of being that doesn't previously exist, as being introduced as a complication in the family, in all kinds of public space, you need others, right, to reaffirm that you do exist, to bring those things into being together, but also, yeah, to kind of move forward. And I think with Feminism Interrupted, I shopped it out to everyone. I said, everyone read this and tell me what you think. And I did this less with this book because I was scared, but I did like send it to a few people, and I did. It felt very collaborative in the way the project kind of came out, and I'm thinking constantly about what the purpose of queerness is and the purpose of a queer life. And I guess it's to, much like feminism, to clarify, but to also to let us know what the boundaries are and how we can exceed them, right? To complicate it. And I think that that's the relationship that queerness has to feminism. The queers are always coming in and throwing, you know, especially to the materialists, like throwing in these oddballs where you're like, deal with me and my desire and my subjectivity, blah, blah, blah. And I see that as an additive thing. I see it as a joy. I see it as a pleasure to contend and think about your own body and in lots of different ways. But there's a piece in here that's like specifically about gender and like specifically about thinking through what's going on in this very dangerous, like turfy moment in terms of the re-inscription of like biology and attachments to biology. It's like in the course of the arguments that I'm making in this book, it's like, do you think biology remains, or like,
do you think it'll save us?
Like, no. There are lots of things that like I think have to go, or have to be untethered, or have to be kind of unthought. And I think that that's what queerness is, or what it does in my life. It's a mode of like unthinking or undoing or deconstructing, and not necessarily about my own subjective experiences or like what my identity is.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we've spoken about this, but I think for me, often I feel alienated by queerness sometimes because I feel like, or certain manifestations of queerness, and we know what those manifestations are, because I think like a gaggle of like liberal individual sovereign subjects does not make for liberation, you know. And I think what your book does is exactly the opposite of that. It's not saying, okay, let's all collect as like liberal normative subjects and work towards something. It's actually saying, let's work anonymously, let's defy visibility. And the point that you made about, you know, the queers are always problematizing the material. Like, I'm gonna be like the nerd that I am, and like, I don't know, it really frustrates me when like queer theory, and especially queer of color critique, is not seen as materialist, because like Roderick Ferguson's like introduction to Aberrations Black is like a close reading of Capital, but like that's not seen as canon by the materialists, and that has to do with what they see as material, right? The queers have always been materialists, but they also
had to survive.
Yeah,
so it's like,
but they also know how to have fun, because life is miserable and no one knows that more than them.
Yeah. That's very true.
How much time do we have? Oh shit, okay. That went by really quickly. I had so many questions. Do you see this paper? Okay. I want you to tell me about how you played with your craft with this book. Specifically, how you toy with genres, critical fabulation, creative nonfiction, fiction. What was that process like for you?
I think I'm in kind of talking about this book to other people, I say, because Feminism Interrupted came out first, people, I guess, expect a certain kind of writing from me, but my undergrad was English literature, unfortunately. So, so I feel like this book is in a ways, an example of like the kind of playfulness that I wish to adopt in the text. And in terms of, I guess, in terms of the craft, like, I was thinking a lot about just like letting go of specific conventions. And if I really wanted to do that, this book could look so different. It could be in a million different formats. But within, I thought, the closed sections of a book, what can I do to demonstrate that play? How can I think about how the text is laid out on the page, but also how can I think about like not over-editing myself or not being... There's a piece in here that's about kind of dreaming, and I remember I wrote it just by like putting on this song, which is the Florence and the Machine song, which is on the playlist.
Cute,
and just like
cute.
writing, and I was like sitting next to my grandma who was like watching a crime detective show, and I was just like writing, blah, blah, blah. And then I got to the end and I was like, okay, whatever it says is just going to be on the page, and I'm going to just take out the bits that make absolutely no sense. And so like and that's really fun, that's really playful. I think with the craft element of it, I wanted to incorporate as much as I could or represent this playfulness, this like movement from, okay, we're going to try this and then we're going to absolutely do this. Some bits will be numbered, some bits won't. Some bits it'll feel like I'm talking directly to you, and some bits will feel like an essay. And then I wanted each section to be grounded by a short story, because I wanted a way to think through things in a longer form that didn't feel as kind of like tight as an essay feels sometimes. And so I just invented a bunch of these characters, and one's about revolution, one's about a girl who doesn't want to become a bird, another is about this person who flits and kind of swishes through time. And I put them all together, and it suddenly made sense. It took some rejigging, it took some editing, but I see, as the book was kind of finishing, I was like, oh, I use the same words. Oh, I use the same things recur. And instead of seeing that as a mistake, I was like, no, it's very in keeping with the circle. It's very in keeping with this idea of repetition as an important way of thinking about like one's political life. Oh, your earring just dropped. And you know, other things.
I think that the playfulness really comes out in the book, and I think I fully had a thought there, and it completely slipped my mind. But tell me more about that playfulness.
Yeah, I think that...
Oh, wait, actually, it came back.
Okay.
We have spoken a lot about how, or we've, like, talked to each other about how, like, we could never make art because you have to be a bit shameless to be an artist. You have to be okay with to be a bit embarrassing.
Yeah.
But, like, how do you reconcile with that, with, like, allowing yourself to make mistakes? In a way, I feel like you're relinquishing control in that sense.
Yeah, I think it was a real exercise in like I said before, letting go, but also recognizing that like the aim even in any political space is not to be this like smartest person in the room in any way, shape or form, or at least I'm not interested in that, but to also have the humility to be able to say, okay, I didn't know that, and tell me more, or I changed my mind. And that changing one's mind is a really central aspect to this book, and that relates to like, if you like I said, the other book launch, if you really wanted to, you could find the things that I wrote and believed when I was 18. That there's no greater embarrassment than that. So like, right now it doesn't really matter. Like maybe in 2 months or in a year I'll be like, oh. And there are already bits of the book that I'm kind of like, But that to me is enacting that thing that I'm saying that we should all do collectively, which is to lean into mistake, to lean into failure, so someone can say, I didn't like this, and I'll be like, okay, I didn't like it too. Like there are aspects of it that I found troubling or tricky or like whatever, and that's a method also, I think, for political organizing specifically, to be able to say, we got it wrong, or actually, guys, this isn't making the effect that we want, or how do we recalibrate? How do we re-strategize, essentially?
Okay, I want to leave time for questions. So I want you to what I want you to do is I'll ask you a question now, or I'll ask you to speak about the piece that I want you to read, and we'll finish on that piece, and then we'll go to questions. Does that sound good? I want you to tell me about the last piece that you've written for the book, and how, in a way, it connects to what you were just saying about. I don't want to say the word failure, but
no,
yes,
it was
failure.
You can say failure.
And you say it in the beginning of the piece as well, failure. And I want you to explain the piece, contextualize it for the people about that process of failure in that piece.
Yeah, so there was originally a piece in this book where I was trying to write from the perspective of a child, because I think that there are loads of discourses around childhood in relation to climate catastrophe that I think are really kind of gross and disgusting. And I wanted to, in that piece, try and think about how we can think about the wonder that children have and the zest for life that they possess, how we might, bring that into our own being and not let, growing up alienate us from that wonder. So I wanted to kind of explore that. And I did it through this thing. And then I sent it to everyone, and every single person was like, take this out. This is not.
It just read a bit.
This reads like someone who has not spoken to a 5-year-old, which is true.
It's true,
Which is true.
It shows,
I have
and
not
that's
spoken
okay.
to a 5-year-old.
There's humility in that.
It was very ideal in terms of what a 5-year-old would say or think. and there was a stubborn part of me that was like no, and then Farhana and Brekna were like, take it out, and I was like, okay. So I took it out, and I'm so glad that I did, because it was really bad. But I replaced it with this little end note, which kind of reflects on those discourses. I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's kind of long, but I'll read some. Should I read the whole thing? Oh, okay. Well, I'm going to read the whole thing now. This is the end note of the book. I wanted something of the child in here to give them the chance to speak to you in their own words. But children are hard to imitate. They are precariously situated between ownership and mercy. The nuclear family turns children into property. To be young is to know that much of your life, your capacity for an expression of feeling, dreams and wishes, physical need, is being organized by some other entity, your caregivers, the state, structuralized brutality. You remember the pain of all those people who assigned you a fate without asking. To be a child is to be the object of fascination. Your development is studied meticulously so that others may trace where they went wrong. We are always searching for a corrective, some way of tapping into our full potential as human beings, young or old. I don't know any children well enough to steal anecdotes or ideas from them for this book. I couldn't mimic them with any success. What I do know is that the promise of childhood, like so many other promises, is not often honored. Some theorists want to turn children into the boogeyman. Children are queer negation, everything we are not. They represent all the things we can never achieve. They are a bore, they kill subversion, they weigh us down. When we look at children, we see the time we could have had or the mistakes of our own parenting. We become convinced that children are only mirrors to our own sacrifice. The eco-fascists want us to believe that having a child is cruel and irresponsible as floods rage and forests burn. At the same time, motherhood is either eternal abundance or lack. The child-free identity emerges through Western neoliberal vectors of personal choice and agency. What it disguises is an anti-relation that assumes that this world is a stable and habitable place from which to make choices. The child-free stance misplaces its anger. It blames the wrong thing. It blows up the possibility that we could reorganize the family and the buildings we live in and the food we eat and the education we receive and start taking things for free in order to raise children in ways that make sacrifice or regret or biological drives or gendered alienation impossible. When we talk about the child, what looms in the background is imperative. Well, fuck that. The stranglehold of biology and obligation has made a mess of our desires for too long. It has scuppered our plans, given us children we did not want in a world that could not help us. The imperative isn't to have a child, or even to desire one. The imperative, no matter who you are, is to vow to protect them from all kinds of violence and terror and pain. That is the meaning of collective being. The promise of childhood is not about you, or whether or not you want a child. It's not about whether you can pay thousands of pounds to create one or enlist somebody else to do the work of gestation. It's not about whether you feel stigmatized for not having a child or can jump through the necessary hoops to be assigned one by the state. It's not about your ability or inability to give birth or about whether you purposefully create a chosen family against convention. It is about what we are going to do with a world that places targets on children's backs before they can even understand that they are in danger.
So, questions?
Oh, I also want to say, sorry, before we go to questions, a huge thank you to Brekna and Farhana. I was going to say this at the beginning, but for trusting me, like, with this book. And I really, really implore people to please support Hajar, like, subscribe, buy their books. They're both incredible, and this book wouldn't exist without them. So thank you both.
We have a roaming mic going around. So please feel free to post questions. There's some questions here.
Sure.
Chichi, you better make this good. No, I'm kidding.
I think my answer is probably yes or no, to be honest. Okay, thank you. Hi, fantastic talk. Thank you so much. And I'm so glad, Abeera, that you asked Lola to read the last bit, because that's one of my favorites. And so my question actually was about where you say to be a child is to be the object of fascination. Your development is studied meticulously so that others may trace where they went wrong. And I wanted to ask you, do you think that ever stops, though? Like, people watching your development. And I think I kind of also want you to kind of reflect on your maybe upbringing as well, and heritage.
How long? It can be boundary. You don't have to spill it all out.
Oh. Thank you for that question. I guess what I was trying to say with that is that often when we think about the place of the child in society, it is about like how our childhood affects who we become, right? Like there are so many theories about how early childhood development map out our entire life, right? And so I find that incredibly fascinating alongside all of the other arguments about like nature, nurture, blah, blah, blah. So I think that's what I was trying to say with that. And I do think it stops in a way. I do think, and this is actually what's the child in a way as a concept or as an idea is allowed in certain ways to be quite expansive, right? Because it's like you're going to grow into an adult. Your ideas are going to change. But once you become an adult, those things remain static. There isn't that same ability for transformation that is also attached to the physical growth of a body or the aging of, certain tastes or whatever. So I do think it stops. And I think I'm saying about the promise of childhood, it's more, I think everyone in a way can relate to that, in that I'm saying the way that we live, regardless of whether one had a good upbringing or a bad upbringing, stifles the potential for an expansive life, whether you are a child or whether you are an adult. And so everyone, I think, suffers from this failed promise of childhood, because it's like, what are the conditions of your raising? Even if they were kind of idyllic for you, they're still idyllic in a world where people are fighting to feed their children after 10 years of austerity in this country. That's not, to me, that still seems miserable, right? Like this idea that there isn't, for want of a better word, any kind of equity, any kind of, shared collective upbringing. And I think that, what I guess communism offers, or like, communist states have offered, is like an ability to raise children collectively, right? So that the task of raising a child isn't this private nuclear family in which we know so much violence happens. It is a task that everybody takes on. And I think we would be, I guess I'm trying to say with that piece, maybe people would be happier in that if it were organized in a different way.
Thank you. There's a question. Oh, sorry, there was another question here first, and then we'll get to the back.
Is that okay? Sorry. Yeah, thank you both, and thank you to Hajar for gracing us with this book. I love the book, but the piece that I needed to read at this present moment is "We are going to lose." And the line that sticks with me is, "We make and unmake each other." I think for those of us who, are involved in political organizing, what I appreciate about this book is that you're giving space not just for a collective fight, but also a collective falling apart. So what I'd like to hear from you is, what does that look like for you? What can we practically do to create a space where we can all safely fall apart and pick ourselves back up again?
Did you say fall apart?
Yeah. Thank you.
This is a good question. And I think that, like, in the infrastructure of political organizing, maybe, well, it depends on where you're situated. I think in my own experiences, there have been spaces to have those conversations, or to cry, or to grieve, to understand that, like, this work is continuous, it's affecting it, causes unhappiness in some sense. There have been those spaces, but I feel like it's not often built into, like, the infrastructure of it, because the way that we see it is that we need to keep going regardless of what happens. And so we come to this strange point where that I wrote that piece kind of like about the election, and after the election, the grieving that I was seeing, which I think is rightful, of course, because we all know that meant more people were going to die. That's something that we had to, like, figure out together. But also there's a line in there that's like, okay, so, the numbers fell from the sky and they announced a defeat. Like, does politics end there? And I think that the question is, like, about our ability to think beyond this endless loop that we're going to be in of losing constantly, because that might be the case. It's a question of how do we keep going, how do we pick ourselves up, but how do we also understand that the worlds we seek to build will never be finished. There's not one thing, not one event or one kind of major event that could mean that everything that we want is achieved in one swift move. And so we have to be ready for staggering, and we have to be ready for multiple defeats. We have to be ready for falling apart. Often we do that alone, and maybe, like, the task is to create those collective spaces precisely because we want to put down the despair in order to keep doing it, because we see the way that the despair sits in our chest, in our body, and means that we don't go to the meeting, or we stop, or we alienate ourselves, or the fights or the tensions mean that we don't continue being part of this space. And I think it's a simultaneous thing of, like, we need to bring people in always, and this is what this book is trying to do in kind of that way, but we also need to, tend to ourselves.
Question at the back.
Hello? Yeah. No. So I think this is fine. Yeah. Thank you. Book as well. I am a huge fan. I really appreciate how collective and affirming the book feels when being experiencing, affirming in the sense that it feels like, yeah, I'm not crazy. Like, these conversations are happening, and it is important to say that I don't like this and that I want. So thank you for that and for the conversation. I really love what you said about queers and trans people of color being introduced as a problem. I don't know if it was you or Abeera, but the question is for the both of you, if I'm wrong. How we're usually introduced as a problem, usually in the family, in lecture rooms, and insisting on the otherwise. I realize that it's exhausting, both as I experience it and witness it through my trans and queer loved ones as well, because when it's about you, it's usually less painful. But then you see it in other people and in yourself, and it becomes even more pronounced. Somehow just always wind up pissing someone off as well, because you're always the problem, you're always the troublemaker. And most of the time I try personally to move on from that, but I came to realize that moving on is not necessarily that insistence on the otherwise, or like moving into the otherwise. And these being constantly introduced as a problem becomes slowly a threat to the livelihood of those people, whether it is through immigration and customs, whether it is through workplaces, whether it is disappointed family members, housing, all of that stuff. Especially living in the systems that we live in, as in like and under borders and all of that. So I think like my question specifically is there like an offering or an ode to these people who are always introduced as a problem in spaces in the world, and are insisting on the otherwise, that you would like to offer?
That's a really difficult question to answer, but thank you so much for sharing all of that. I really agree. I think if I were to offer anything, I would say that in my own life, like queer relation or the relationships that I've built with other people make me realize, you know, what is possible, right? And make me realize actually this thing I've been have to read all of this like boring philosophy for my PhD, but like Deleuze says this thing about it's so gross, about how like just because things are not actual, as in concretely existing, doesn't mean they're not real. And I think that is what like queerness has taught me and continues to teach me, that just because the world that I seek to build, or like the queer life that I want to live is not actually existing, doesn't mean that in other senses it can't be touched, tasted, felt. Doesn't mean that it cannot be held and protected. And I think that's a kind of core thing. When you understand actually that impossibility is real, and that the things that get swept under the umbrella of the impossible are being actualized all the time, are being enacted in the ways that we are with one another, are being performed or rehearsed. That really soothes me, because then nobody can say queer life is not possible because of this, or it's an aberration, or no, it isn't. I see it performed, I see it, you know, in the club, I see it in all of these like different spaces, and that's what constantly reminds me that actually the being a problem might not actually be a bad thing, because it enables you, or it gives you the task of having to build a world instead of having to follow what is already prescribed for you. And it is a painful task, but there's also there can also be determination in that. There can also be love. There can also be new ways of knowing yourself and other people tucked into that. Does that make sense?
I think that's a really poignant, beautiful note to end on. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Also,
thank you all for joining. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, thank you to you, Abeera. This is like really special to me. I think of Abeera as one of the keepers of my best ideas. So it's been so like nice for me for us to have this conversation together. So thank you.
Yeah, it wasn't bad. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Lola, for bringing this incredible book into the world. And thank you, Brechna and Farhana, for all the hard work that you put into this. And thank you to Nisha and the ICA staff for,
as well, yes.
for helping bring this all together. Thank you.